Hi, I'm David Halbrook, and if you're watching this, it's probably because you've already watched the discussion that I had with a friend of mine, Joe. He's an atheist, and we discussed assumptions and science and the relationship of God to science. So today I want to just review that, not in its entirety, but 3 topics from that discussion, and to talk about a few things now that I've had a little more time to think about them. The 3 topics I want to touch on is truth, fundamental truths and assumptions, life and non-life, and prophecy. Maybe you remember some of our discussion on those subjects. So the first, on the subject of truth, fundamental truths and assumptions, Joe agreed that science is based upon assumptions, and then one of his questions to me was about my use of the word truth, and he asked about my definition of truth. And he also at some point suggested that maybe what I'm calling fundamental truths mean the same thing as what he calls assumptions. So let me address that just briefly. By definition, an assumption might be true or might not be true. The uncertainty is what makes it an assumption, whereas a truth is something that is true and is not false. Another word for that would be a fact. Now, some truths are more obvious than others, and there are even some truths that we cannot know until we first learn some more fundamental truths. And so, by definition, an assumption cannot be a truth or a fundamental truth. Now, beyond the definition of words, let me give this example that he and I discussed in the area of logic. Joe stated that scientists assume logic exists. Be sure you catch that they assume logic is a real thing. I suppose that's because logic can't be studied by what Joe called methodological naturalism, which is also assumed to be the most productive way of studying and learning about our world. Do you see the point? Everything is based on assumptions. That is a terribly weak foundation that is necessary when God is not included in our learning of any kind. When people preach the gospel, they said things like, we speak words of truth and reason. That's no leap of logic. That's no God of the gap guess. What they used was logic in order to persuade people to believe what they were saying. So while to some people, logic is an assumption, in reality, logic is a fact, not an assumption. Now, how do I know that? And that's a fair question. I know that because God has spoken. And how do I know that? Well, because the Bible predicts specific future events hundreds of years before they occurred. And I'm going to talk more about prophecy in just a moment. So with sufficient evidence to learn that God is and that God has spoken, then I learn from God that logic, that reasoning is a real thing, and that if any unseen realities can be known, and I believe that Joe and I agreed, there are some unseen realities that we can know, then logic can be known, and it doesn't have to be assumed. God provides scientists and doctors and astronomers facts to work from, not assumptions. And for people who want truth, I believe that contrast is hugely important. Are we building from assumptions, or are we building from facts? And for more on this topic, watch 2 or 3 of the first videos in a series called Words of Truth and Reason. You can see that on the YouTube channel of the Chena Small Tracts Church of Christ, or on our website, chenachurch.com. Each of those videos is just about 3 to 5 minutes in length. So take a few minutes and look at that for some further thought. Secondly, the subject of life and non-life came up, and Joe asked 2 questions that I hadn't thought about before. The first that he asked was, is life from an egg and sperm an example of life coming from non-life? Well, The sperm depends upon life to exist and to function, and an egg depends upon life to exist and to function. So the answer is no. This is not an example of life from non-life. And all of our observations, all of our experimentation, and all of our logic leads to the conclusion that life on earth always comes from life. And more important than our experimentation, I know this because I know God is. Because I know God has spoken. And God offers us answers to the question of origins. The answer is God is the source of life. Third, the subject of prophecy is a lengthy one. In 2 Peter 1 and verse 19, after Peter has said that I'm an eyewitness of the things that I'm telling you, therefore he's inviting investigation. He says, we have the prophetic word confirmed, which you do well to heed as a light that shines in a dark place. Joe and I discussed a little bit at the end of our discussion prophecy, and we even talked about a definition of prophecy, and we really did not have the same definition as I recall. When the Bible talks about a prophet, it's referring to someone who is a spokesman for God, a mouthpiece for God. God is miraculously giving them knowledge. They're not speaking of things that they naturally learned. And you could read Exodus 4, 12 through 16 for an example of that mouthpiece as an definition, an applied definition of prophet. Now, admittedly, among the challenges to understand the subject of prophecy is all of the false claims and the false prophecies and the false prophets that exist. They cause confusion, just like there's a lot of confusion because of various claims about a missing link has been found. And when it's investigated, it shows itself to be a fraudulent claim. And that's also true of false prophecies. So true prophecy has to be distinguished from false prophecy. Now, let me give you here are two opportunities you have to learn more about the subject of prophecy. And you can view these at chenachurch.com or also on our YouTube channel. But there's a 7-minute video on this subject. It's video number 6 in the series of videos titled Words of Truth and Reason. And it's titled, I Am the Truth. And so it just gives a very short, simple summary of the connection of several prophecies, providing evidence that God has spoken. And then there's a 44-minute, more in-depth study titled God Presents His Case. And so you could view any of those, either of those, at our website or our YouTube channel. And if you have questions about them, then please ask. But when you compare and combine the words of the prophets of the Old Testament Scripture, then you find words that could not possibly have originated in the mind of man. They could only possibly come from a higher mind. And a higher mind would be God. So prophecy provides sufficient evidence of a supernatural source, and it's the kind of evidence that you can hold in your hand, that you can read. You can be a witness to yourself. You can see what was written long before those events happened, and then you have a record of those events occurring, and you can compare what was said, and you can compare what happened. When you do that, the hard part often is this: what will you do with what you know? Because as you continue to learn, you may not like everything that you learn, and truth is not only a matter of testing our knowledge, it tests our heart, it tests our integrity. What am I willing to do with what I learn? Am I willing to accept it and then use that to learn more? Am I willing to humble myself? Are you willing to humble yourself before a God who has shown himself to be infinitely more knowledgeable and wise and powerful than you are? Someone without whom you have nothing to build your life upon except for assumptions. So You make your choice, assumptions or facts. This is among the greatest questions that you have to answer, and I hope you'll examine the evidence. God presents his case. Research and study his words of truth and reason that lead to the confidence, the assurance that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that life is only in him. God is, and God has spoken.